The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 13. First You'll Sign. It isn't far from Weimar to Buchenwald through the rolling Thuringian countryside. The poet Goethe used to walk the distance from the university town, which was his home, to stroll beneath the beech trees crowning the hill Ettersberg. Those trees had given this wood its name, Buchenwald, and as the words of the poem reflected, brooded over a peace so profound that no breath of air stirred and even the birds hushed their singing. How easily a name takes on the character of its associations. Goethe's forest was raised to make way for barracks and barbed wire and watchtowers, and the beautiful name by which the wood had once been known became in time a byword for all that is ugly and inhumane. All but one of those lovely trees had been cut down. It was the one under which the inspiration for this poem had come. A memorial plaque marked its trunk even yet, and as I was to discover shortly, but in time even this lonely reminder of the beauty that had once reigned there would be removed, but that was still in the future. A sea of barracks rooftops stretched away beneath the roll call square on the hill where Hilda and I stood with 3,000 others that cold February night of our arrival. Barbed wire and bleak wooden buildings, it was all I was aware of in these new surroundings. Of the hunger and fatigue which possessed me, the latter was by far the most agonizing. First, there'd been the long journey by boxcar with a daily slice of bread to keep us alive. Then the wait at Weimar with doors shut while officialdom decided our fate. At least from the scattered snatches of conversation I'd heard through the siding, I gathered that moving such a large body of people about was no small feat. Too bad I didn't appreciate the genius involved in these operations. Disembodied voices had been our only contact with the outside world, businesslike ones that calculated bodies and miles and minutes, and the one sympathetic voice that had expressed surprise and a touch of dismay, too, that human beings were being transported over the rails like cattle. Now I was standing numbly on yet another roll call ground and wondering how hard the boards would be here, how much barley we'd find in the soup, how long the winter would linger when my threadbare dress would totally disintegrate. The interminable wait was over, and we women were led down the hill. As much as I could, I helped Hilda, but we were both staggering when we entered one of the one-storied barracks at last. What a sight met our eyes! Beds, real metal beds, and on them straw sacks and blankets. Even an oven was lit, and toilets, and wash basins, too. Who could believe such wonders existed anymore? Forgotten was our hunger as each of us removed our clothes and crawled into our own beds. I lay in a strange euphoria, wanting desperately to sleep, wanting at the same time to sense the luxury into which I'd plunged. I pushed an exploring hand, then a foot, here and there over the rustling straw mattress, and rubbed a bare shoulder against the rough blanket which covered me. Thank God, I spoke with words inwardly over and over again. Thank God for having a narrow iron cot and a prickly straw sack all to myself. For the next few days, our little Roswitha was the belle of the camp. All the officers came to see her. One of them spoke with an accent which struck a chord of memory, and on a chance I spoke a few words of Bashkiran. The black eyes lit up. You, a German woman, speak my language? He asked in broken Russian. There seemed something so wistful in his manner. Quickly, I took advantage of the moment to ask for milk for the baby. An aide who accompanied him explained that an officer couldn't concern himself with our rations, but he would see what he could do. What he could do turned out to be far more than my faith had anticipated, for every day thereafter he came to our barracks with a canteen of milk. No doubt this merciful act so faithfully performed kept our baby alive, and again I had to thank the God whose ways are past finding out for preparing me so long ago to have a hand in this small service. One night soon after our arrival, a windstorm ripped off 2/3 of our barracks roof. For nerves which reacted as ours did, the ripping of timbers and the screaming of the wind over our exposed heads was a terrible experience. To make the nightmare worse, our flight from the falling debris was accompanied by wild shots from the tower guards, who must have thought we were trying to break out, as indeed we were, but only to safety. Gone was the comfort of our own beds. We 500 women crowded into the undamaged end of the building, there to remain from February to May. That there were empty brick barracks I knew. I'd seen them. But Moscow, or wherever orders originated, was far away, and we had to huddle two to a bed during the remainder of the winter. In May we moved at last to the big 2-storied brick barracks. It was to be my home for the next 4 years. Here again we each had a bed and a blanket. Here, too, were white walls and windows which we could open to the sun. Like the others, our building was fenced off so that inmates could be kept within their own compound. Now only on special occasions did we congregate together on the hilltop square for a general roll call. It was an all-day ordeal to account for 16,000 prisoners, or it was stretched into one. Otherwise, each barracks had its own 6 o'clock roll call within its own fenced enclosure. Each morning we woke to the deep-throated gong as the empty bombshell on top of the hill was struck. It didn't take long to put on the black georgette dress and the worn-out shoes. Between morning and evening roll call we were free. Into this vacuum of time we somehow had to fit our lives, and the creation of some kind of endurable existence became an ever-present problem. Most people try to find ways of avoiding work. Our aim was just the opposite. A few women were called immediately for cleaning jobs in the officers' private quarters on the outside, and daily I led these fortunate 12 to 15 women to the gate. For most, however, boredom became an exquisite form of torture. Among the 500 of us there were, of course, some highly educated women, notably 2 doctors, a geologist, and an astronomer. It was after the novelty of our freedom had worn off and after our interminable conversations had ceased to yield anything new that we came to realize the potential we had in our midst. Our first course was in first aid and general nursing. Though we had nothing to work with, we became experts in theory, at any rate. We women had a special concern, however. Fears of pregnancy were over, but VD was another matter. Often our anxious questions centered on its detection and cure, and the answers, when they came, weren't too encouraging. Professor von Wolf, our inmate gynecologist, could be consulted only at general roll call and under rather limited circumstances, as one could imagine. He explained that the infection might lie in a latent state for as long as 15 years. Without a proper examination, he couldn't make a diagnosis. After it did make itself known, it would probably be too late anyway. For the many of us who'd been raped, it was a dismal verdict. Our own women doctors, however, did confirm a fact that we had ourselves observed. The death rate among the women was much lower than among the men. This gave rise to interesting and amusing debates. Some declared it was due to our physical superiority, others to a psychological advantage. Dr. Pfeiffer stated simply that women have reserves because of their biological differences. They are equipped to supply for that potential extra life which God has prepared them to produce. I myself had experienced that extra measure of strength. As to the other, I could only appeal to the physician who had cleansed the leper and pray for cleansing too. Many of us had had wartime Red Cross training, so for us our health lectures were a snap course. On to geology then. Here one could become a bit more graphic and make earthen reconstructions of various geological formations. With only 6 weeks of public school education and a nighttime secretarial course to my credit, I became an enthusiastic observer, in my imagination, of fossils and faults and oil-bearing strata. For young inmates like Ulrika, these sessions became a higher education that they'd likely never have known otherwise, as 14 was often the terminal age for our German girls as far as public education was concerned. Astronomy became one of my favorites. To this day, the sky is an adventure land of constantly revolving constellations, and the positions of Orion, the Seven Sisters, and Vega are as familiar to me as the streets of the village where I now live. Here again the bare ground was our drawing board, as Professor Schmidt traced our lessons with a long stick. Our first practical project was to learn how to tell time by the sun. This was important anyway if we were to have any sort of punctuality in our classes, and with scholarly dedication we estimated angles and tangents. Homework we did at night. Then those nearest the windows were assigned to make observations and report their findings to the rest of the class. Only the segment of the sky directly over the roof went unmapped, and one astronomy enthusiast was even heard to wish she were back in the roofless barrack for just one clear night. Malin knew 80 book titles and their exciting contents. Here was a source of both education and entertainment as we launched upon our Great Books program. Poor Malin, it took a while before she became an expert raconteur, and our first sessions were a series of puzzled demands to know what happened to Adele, or you forgot to explain how Hans arrived home if his bicycle was stolen. I suspected a little originality here and there, as Malin's memory failed, but during those 4 years of our Buchenwald captivity, I'm sure she exceeded by far the accomplishments of any book circle chairman one could find outside the fence. Why it was forbidden to sing in camp, no one could understand, nor would anyone obey the order. Everyone must know that singing is as much a part of the German heritage as bratwurst and the Lorelei. Every child learns to sing in harmony from his first school years, and those few who don't at least love the old folk songs and the works of our master composers. Our Helvige was a beautiful girl, ethereal, angelic, words fail me. Her father had been an organist, and she was a gifted musician as well. To live without her beloved music was impossible, and in our basement she organized a chamber choir. Of course it was verboten, and of course I, as interpreter, always channeled these orders to our barracks. The order was given. Predictably, it was disobeyed, and predictably I was punished. It didn't matter. The glorious music produced in the tightly closed-up basement room more than made up for the night spent in the dungeon. Because Helvige was an organist, not a vocalist, she didn't know librettos. She did know her harmony, though, and with those flesh-and-blood vocal chords, she achieved an instrument of music to rival the chamber orchestras I'd heard with Fred in Berlin. When the dings, bings, bongs, and hums had merged and melted together to Helvige's satisfaction, we were invited below for a concert, there to forget for a brief hour everything else but the unearthly beauty which echoed from the gray basement walls. Clothes. What woman isn't interested in the subject? But clothes had a far greater importance for us than adornment. Some women had been picked up in their nightgowns, some in evening dress, and some in underwear. Krista, our beauty queen, had arrived among us wearing inexplicably only a man's shirt, with an extra-long tail. Of course, our first consideration had been to get clean, and this we'd done as soon after arriving as the long lines in front of each basin would permit. The fine white sand in back of the barracks had served as soap, for hair as well as skin, and the wind had substituted for towels. The showers, we learned, were to come at regular 3-month intervals, but some more suitable clothing was really a necessity, for much more attention had been given in each camp to removing clothing from the inmates than to distributing it. It is understandable, then, that when I was called one day to an assignment for the officer in charge of a storage warehouse, I should stare in ecstatic rapture at the piles of woolen skirts, dresses, and jackets doing no one any good in that vast storeroom. From the looks of it, it was probably contraband, the best that could be found along with the toasters and typewriters and radios whose collection I had participated in. A quick question. The officer was in a good mood, and away I went, staggering under an armload of clothing. Once more I went, and miraculously came away with another. How to make the pile which I flung down on our floor suffice even for the needs of our room? That was the question. It called for some cooperative thinking, a wholesome occupation. The solution? We would make garments for those who needed them the most. Moreover, every inch of fabric and every strand of thread would be utilized. Lining, interlining, trimmings, hems, all meticulously expanded to their full potential. Sewing tools, another puzzler to be thought out. Smuggled in by the outgoing workers, we got tin can lids. They were our scissors. It was a precarious business, this smuggling, but again an agreeable guard could make things easier. Remnants yielded thread, but needles were a real problem until someone thought of carefully pulling a few hair-thin copper strands from an electric cord. These, twisted double with a loop at the top, were our needles. Of course, one must pull a thread first in order to penetrate any fabric with these clumsy affairs, but time we had plenty of, and seams were sewn sturdily and permanently. Several times I was able to bring a few blankets, and from these our most gifted designers and seamstresses produced coats and jackets. I, too, had a new garment, a beautiful black skirt to wear under the tattered georgette. Though I didn't again get a windfall to equal the first one, I was never called to this particular officer without coming away with something for our women, and by summer each of us had some sort of new garment. Clothes and hot water with which to wash them go together. Of cold water we had plenty, which in itself was a miracle, but I had my heart set on a bigger one. In the basement was a washroom, well equipped with tubs and faucets. So of the medic officer who supplied Roswitha with milk, I asked what must have been the most audacious of questions. "We have such a good place for one, couldn't we have a hot water heater?" It sounded so ridiculous I almost laughed at myself. "Sure, find one." The answer seemed almost as silly as the question. It was a challenge. Because I was the only woman allowed to move outside the wire of our barracks, I did a little investigating as I reported here and there for my interpreting assignments. In a certain empty barracks was a heater, I heard. By the time I could get there, it was gone. In another location, I could find an unused one, I was told. This one was where it was supposed to be, and again I reported to the medic. "Get it out," was the response. "That's your business." From our commandant, I got permission to remove it, and one of the men inmates hooked it up. Those who have been in the shower on a Saturday night and have experienced the gradual, chilling realization that the 3 preceding users have managed to empty the hot water tank will wonder how 500 women ever managed to live with one hot water heater. But it didn't take much for women who had experienced the locked faucets of Viso and the sealed boxcars from Landsberg to achieve a system of using our precious supply equitably. With the passing of our first summer and the coming of fall, our airy barracks no longer seemed so pleasant. We discovered already in May that no heat ever came from those fine-looking radiators. We'd gotten a hot water heater. How about something to heat our room? Again we began thinking. At the next special roll call, I managed to maneuver myself to be near Kruger, the electrician. Though it was forbidden to talk, no number of guards could have prevented the stealthy exchanges that always marked these occasions. "Psst! We need some heat in our barracks. Any ideas?" "Are your lights on all night like ours?" he asked. Of course our lights were on all night. In fact, they were never turned off. But we'd gotten used to it. If some night owls wanted to stay up late and talk or hum or recite poetry, the rest of us had to adjust. But I wondered why Kruger had asked. "Get me in there and I'll hook up some wires for you." "No chance. Tell me what to do." Kruger looked at me sideways, and I was sure I read a bit of scorn in his honest German face. What? A woman meddling with the wires? She'd blow up Buchenwald. I read the message clearly. "Tell me how," I begged. "You'd probably get caught anyway if you came down." He relented, and I listened carefully to his instructions. In his rounds, he'd got hold of the insulated wire that was necessary and somehow smuggle it in. A few nights later, I went to the basement fuse box and looked at the panel in bewilderment. He'd said to bring a board to stand on and a smaller one to shove the fuse in when I was finished. I pulled a lever, hoping it was the right one, and quickly I removed the fuse and inserted the 2 wires behind the screws. Back it went into place, and I reached to turn on the power. That beautiful coil of wire lay ready to run up through the floor above. Would it work? A crackling flash of light and a small explosion, which to my ears sounded deafening, was my answer. In a panic, I snatched the wire and hid it behind some boards and fled upstairs. Only a few of my friends guessed why the lights had suddenly gone out in the women's barracks, and why the juice for our electric fence had also ceased flowing. Of course, there was a great scurrying of guards, and no doubt a good deal of speculation, but all was repaired quickly by Kruger. Now he could legitimately do the job right. Guarded as he was, he found ample reason to send me upstairs several times in order to check the lights. Thus I got the copper wire properly strung in just the way he wanted it. At last he checked it all out and turned to the guard. "It'll work now," he declared happily. What he really meant was, "There's an innocent-looking copper wire safely connected to this fuse box, which will help keep 500 women warm this winter." And it did. Nothing blistering about the heat, certainly, but if you can imagine the warmth from an old-fashioned toaster, you have a pretty good idea of the heat generated along the insulated wire that now stretched across our floor. Life began to take on a regular routine, though two questions never ceased circulating among us. Why are we here, and when are we going home? Repeatedly I was begged when an officer approached to question him. Hopefully, from the variety of answers we got, we could piece together some notion of our fate. If the officer was pleasant, the answer was usually a shrug of the shoulder and a non-committal, "I don't know." Others tossed off cruder answers. "You'll be here until you die," said one. For us women, the singing groups and the lessons helped fill the time until that dismal day should arrive. A few fortunate men, on the other hand, had a more varied existence, for scattered throughout their section were a great many shops of all kinds. These had been set up during Nazi times, and the well-equipped small businesses repaired or turned out watches, clothing, cabinet work, leather and metal goods, and a host of other items. Often I accompanied visiting Russian officers as they toured our model camp. Of course, a great attraction was the tailor shop, where a fine-fitting suit could be had for nothing from a confiscated roll of men's worsted. Many hours I spent in that shop translating to the tailor the style and cut and color demanded by an eager young captain thrilled at the prospect of his first custom-made suit. One day an officer brought his wife in and demanded that I tell the tailor to design her a hat. "But he's not a hat maker," I said. The woman looked indignant and ordered her husband to insist that I head for the milliner's immediately. She no doubt had something special in mind and would stand for neither delay nor excuses. "There is no milliner," I replied. "But," spluttered the husband, looking a little uncomfortable, "among all these tailors you must have someone who makes hats." "As a matter of fact, we don't," I said. "I suppose no milliner was captured. If you want a hat," I continued, turning to the woman, "why don't you go out and catch someone who can make hats?" I should have been put in the dungeon for that, but the officer and his wife seemed more intent on disappearing than on getting me into trouble. Another time I wasn't so fortunate. I was called to the watchmaker's shop to translate a special request. On the table an officer carefully placed an alarm clock and requested me to order a wristwatch made from its works. First the watchmaker smiled, sure that it was a joke. Then he shook his head vigorously. "Nein, nein," he said repeatedly. "Niet," I said to the officer. "Impossible." He wouldn't take niet for an answer, though, and angrily insisted that if the Germans could build airplanes, then the watchmaker could certainly do this little thing if he tried. A wristwatch with an alarm might not be such a bad idea, but this master craftsman just wouldn't demean his profession, and we both landed in the dungeon for his stubbornness. We were standing in front of our barracks for roll call one evening. It was well past 6, and our commandant hadn't arrived yet. Usually he started at the top of the hill with the men's barracks. From there we could watch his progress as he worked his way down. Tonight there'd been no sign of him anywhere, and we were getting restless. At last there was the sound of a horse's hoofs, but coming from below us in the direction of the shops and greenhouse. We just had time to arrange ourselves at rigid and poker-faced attention when his horse came into view. But what was this atop the familiar big white mare? Our commandant? Our stern-visaged commandant, who wouldn't even permit us to smile in his presence, as though there were a great deal to smile about anyway. I suppose the first thing I noticed, even before the armload of flowers he carried, were the socks. They were the palest of baby pink and worn with bright red velvet slippers. His appearance alone was enough for him to lose all authority, but his first words froze the smile on every woman's face. "Who's the most beautiful woman here?" he bawled to no one in particular. Of course there was utter silence. None of us wanted that frightening distinction. "Say, tell me, who's the most beautiful woman here?" he bellowed again. He was roaring drunk, and his foolish smile landed at last on me. "All right, you tell me, Fräulein," he said, waving the bouquet of flowers in my direction. They were gorgeous blooms, great red poppies and white marguerites and blue delphiniums. Obviously, they were from our greenhouse, and just possibly his wife had ordered them brought home that evening. Whatever had prompted the gathering of this bouquet had been forgotten somewhere between the bottles of vodka, and I knew I must answer carefully or the ludicrous situation would end in tragedy for some unfortunate woman. Please, God, I prayed, tell me what to say. With a bright smile I answered, "Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder." The bloodshot eyes filmed over with sentiment, and with what he no doubt intended as a gracious gesture, he motioned toward all of us with a bouquet and declared, "You are all equally beautiful." With that, he handed the bouquet to me. "Put the flowers where every woman could enjoy them." I received the flowers on behalf of all of us, and managed to look solemnly grateful until he trotted off, roll call forgotten. The flowers went in our barracks entrance just in front of the stairway to our upstairs room. The vase? It was a big white globe, unscrewed from a ceiling fixture and ever so carefully filled with water. Humorous incidents were few and far between, and like the one above, never without their dangerous elements. On another occasion I was called in the middle of a cold winter's night to one of the men's barracks. Up and down the rows of men huddled outside, I walked beside the commandant as he asked each one in turn, "Did you get your bread today?" What could he mean? Of course each man replied, "Ja," as he shivered in the chill night air. Furiously the officer turned on them when he'd finished. "So why are you asking? Give us this day our daily bread." There were a few ill-concealed smiles among the men when I translated the pitiful question. Someone who'd never heard the Lord's Prayer had obviously caught the men at their evening prayers, and our commandant naturally couldn't let this defamatory request go unchallenged. Ridiculous as the incident might seem, word of events like this made the rounds among our Russian officers and prompted more than a few questions as to my belief in God. One officer I remember so well. He was young and often seemed to have such a pensive air as he walked alone or contemplated in solitude a particularly lovely sunset. One night he came to the women's barracks and sought me out. He wanted to talk. This was natural enough, since I was the only woman who spoke Russian, but our talk got around rather quickly to my belief in God, and he confided in me the big question that was his one absorbing interest. "How does the universe run so smoothly?" he asked. "There must be something more to it than what I've learned from science." In the time I had, I shared with him the story of our wonderful Creator come to earth as Savior. He listened entranced. Never had he seen a Bible, and he wanted so much to read what it said for himself. Miraculously, I remembered an address. There was a Russian congregation still meeting in Berlin, a faithful remnant from those years when my father had worked with the Fettler mission. There he could get a Russian Bible, I was sure. Some months later he told me that he had indeed been in Berlin, had found the congregation, and was now reading the Bible he'd been given there. Though I never knew the final result of his quest, I had to believe that our meeting had been planned by the one who ran the universe so smoothly. The food, always bad in Buchenwald, plummeted both in quantity and in quality about this time. It was the fall of 1946, and the 180 grams of bread a day and the thin barley soup we received at noon sufficed only to start the terrible contractions by which our stomachs signaled their need. With the hunger, tensions increased. In the beginning, the contrast to what we'd known in other camps had seemed so great. Now it was again just routine, and despair was the general mood. Whether loved ones were dead or alive, husbands faithful, children cared for, whether the war was even over, these were the questions that plagued each of us. To share a sorrow with another is a relief, but when that other one's tragedy is even greater, and who doesn't feel their own misfortune to be the worst, then the sharing of burdens sometimes becomes frustrating, and so it was now. From the few interrogations I'd already had, I'd gotten a pretty good idea why I, at least, was there. For despite all the disinterest I expressed in things political, I was considered a prime prospect for conversion to the communist cause. I prayed all the way to the interrogation office that wintry afternoon when I was again called. Would it be promises this time? Threats? A beating? Whatever it was, I needed strength. Cold and hungry, and more than a little scared, I hurried through the occasional snowflakes that were falling from the gray skies. Always these interrogations seemed to be scheduled when one was hungriest, and right now I was simply ravenous. The warm room engulfed me like a comforting blanket as I stepped inside. The next moment I was looking into the smiling face of the cruelest of our interrogators. He was known as the hangman. Sit down, he said genially, pointing to the chair beside his desk. Somehow his smile seemed more frightening than his anger, and I was wary as I seated myself mechanically. Now, Frau Linke, let us talk some sense, shall we? Think of your own good as I am. Since when had he ever thought of anyone's good, I wondered. Why should you spend your life this way when you could have everything a woman needs to be happy? Pretty clothes, furs, a car, a nice furnished apartment. Food, I wanted to add. At this moment, a soldier brought in a steaming tray, and I couldn't believe my eyes or nose. There was roast duck, my favorite, potatoes, vegetables. The odor coming from the heaping plate of food was maddening, and I had an overwhelming impulse to bury my face in its delicious depths. It could only mean freedom, my last meal in captivity. I'd always imagined it like this. There was an indulgent laugh. Yes, that's for you, and it's only the beginning, too. But here he casually pushed a piece of paper across the desk toward me. First, you'll sign this. It was a trick. How could I have been so naive? Sick with disappointment, I didn't even bother to look at the paper. He must have noticed my reaction, but without a pause, he continued in his low, persuasive tone. You'll be one of the elite, one of the most valuable members of Germany's new socialist society. Where could you find a better future, or a more useful one? The voice droned on, heard through a dizzying swirl of now fully aroused hunger pangs. You'll have the chance to travel. Not many are able to do that these days, you know. You'll be sent to Moscow for political training. You'll meet the finest and most progressive young people. Dully, I looked at him and said simply, But you don't understand. I'm not the type you're looking for. I'm not interested in politics. I just want to go home to my family. Stupid, he yelled. Fool, I'll teach you. With one furious motion of his hand, he flung the tray of hot food into my face. It was the signal for the guard to come in. Together they threw a blanket over my head and knocked me to the floor. The blows turned to kicks, and kicks to the full-weighted stamp of boots up and down my back. At last a tremendous blow on the head, and blackness. When I awoke, I was in the dungeon. Seeming to fill the universe was the searing pain that jolted my head with each throb of my pulse. Somewhere below that torrent of pain were my arms, I knew, but when I tried to lift them to my head, they wouldn't respond. Horrified, I opened my eyes. Yes, they were there, but they seemed by their lack of sensation to be detached from the rest of my aching body. Every ligament and muscle in shoulders, chest, and abdomen felt as if it had been torn apart. when the clank of the soup kettle came down the corridor, paused at my door, then passed me by. I lapsed into unconsciousness again. The hangman stood over me when next I awoke, and in his hand was the same paper with its prepared confession. "Have you had enough, Maria Linke?" he asked. "Will you sign now?" Wearily I turned my head away. Why should I bother to answer? Instantly there was a violent movement in the corner and the scrape of metal on concrete as the foul contents of the oil drum were dumped over onto me. Then the door slammed shut, and I was alone again. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I remembered Job. What hadn't he endured? Was I better than he? Helpless, I lay among the flies and worms and stinking refuse, and prayed. If ever I was in the valley of the shadow of death, I knew it was now, and yet, just as surely, I knew he was with me, and for that I gave thanks. I didn't die after all, and in time I was able to sit against the wall. One night there was a stealthy knock at my door, and through the watch-hole I heard my name whispered. Maria tried to come to the door. Painfully I made my way across the wet floor and pulled myself up to where I could reach the small package being thrust through the hold. "Eat, quickly," said the voice, and was gone. My fingers touched a slimy mass. Just a new form of torture was my first thought. The aroma told me otherwise, however, and I stuffed the contents of the hot packet into my mouth. Mashed potatoes, with lots of butter. Oh, how good it tasted. For 10 days the same gift was thrust through the watch-hole by the unseen one whose heart God had touched to feed me. When I was sent back to the barracks, pale and weak, I was told I'd been gone for 4 weeks. I could move my arms again, but my shoulders were still painful, and on my head I had a big bump the size of a goose egg. By Christmas I could stand on roll call and was again hurrying here and there as I was needed on interpreting missions. How bleak the walls and rooftops looked that closed in on me everywhere. How impregnable the barbed wire of our electric fence. I loved nature so much. Would I ever see more of God's creation than the one tree still remaining from the once lovely Buchenwald? The birds are hushed in the forest. Only wait. Soon you will be silent, too. The lines of Goethe's poem seemed to mock me as I returned late on New Year's Eve from the officers' quarters to my barracks. A deep silence pervaded the compound, and I felt so alone on that festive night. Then, from afar, I heard the faint reverberation of a bell. The Gloriosa, Erfurt's giant cathedral bell. I'd been told that its sound reached here occasionally, but I'd never heard it myself. Now it was pealing in the new year, just for me, it seemed. Pensively I listened. For others it was a happy sound, bringing a message of hope, of another year, of brighter days. A sob caught in my throat. Mother, home, Fred. Would I ever see them again? Tears came, hot, bitter ones, and when the final note had been struck, I flung myself down to feel its last vibrations pulsating through the frozen earth.